The Cold War inspired countless Soviet and American aircraft. One of the most impressive was, and still is, the SR-71 Blackbird. It was designed to be a high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that could not be shot down because the Soviets had nothing, not an airplane or a missile that could catch it. That is, until the MiG-31 entered the fray. This is the story of the Soviet scheme to intercept and shoot down the fastest spy plane on Earth. Intelligence is one of the most important factors in one's ability to defeat their enemy on the battlefield. If you can predict what they are going to do and then be ready to counter it before they do it, you stand a good chance of beating them. That's why countries spend a great deal of money and resources on intelligence gathering activities. Such was the case during the Cold War. In the mid-1950s, the United States needed to learn as much as it could about the Soviet Union's military installations and their intercontinental ballistic missile and nuclear weapons programs. The U-2 spy plane had been designed to gather photographic intelligence to help in this endeavor. Looking more like a glider than a jet-powered airplane, the U-2 was not stealth or fast. So to counter the Soviet air defenses, it simply flew higher and out of reach of any Soviet plane or missile. And that seemed to work for a while, until it didn't. On May 1st, 1960, a U-2 flown by Francis Gary Powers was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile while flying a high-altitude reconnaissance mission for the CIA. As you can imagine, the incident heightened Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and had significant diplomatic repercussions. So in the age before spy satellites, if you couldn't fly higher than the Soviet air defenses, you had to fly faster, and the SR-71 was designed to do just that. The SR-71 Blackbird is one of the most legendary planes in all of aviation. It looked different and certainly performed different than anything that had ever been flown. Its two Pratt & Whitney J58 turbojet engines produced 25,000 pounds of thrust each and propelled the Blackbird at Mach 3+, or 2,200 miles an hour. That's faster than a bullet shot out of a rifle, and it could fly at an altitude of 85,000 feet. When it entered service with the United States Air Force in 1964, the Soviets had nothing, no aircraft or missile that could reach it. But that didn't stop them from trying.
Gotta try.
In 1972, the Soviets introduced the first big MiG, the MiG-31 Foxhound. It was designed to be a supersonic interceptor with the hope that it would be capable of defeating U.S. aircraft such as the B-58 Hustler, the B-70 Valkyrie, and the SR-71. By the mid-1970s, the MiG-25s had become the backbone of the Soviet Union's interceptor inventory. The Foxbats were stationed near the Soviet border with the task of intercepting Blackbirds. As all countries do, after the MiG-25 became operational, the Soviets began planning for its replacement. The result was the MiG-31 Foxhound. The 31 entered service with the Soviet Union Air Force on May 6, 1981. By 1983, there were only 2 regiments flying the MiG-31s, and their primary mission was to intercept the American spy plane, and should it breach Soviet airspace, shoot it down. Major Mikhail Miyagi. Miyagi? Am I saying it right? Miyagi? We'll go with Miyagi. Major Mikhail Miyagi was one of the MiG-31 pilots tasked with intercepting the Blackbird. He recounts the procedure for intercepting an SR-71 in an article that appeared in the Aviation Geek Club. According to the Major, the procedures for successfully intercepting an SR-71 were crazy and completely inadequate. The speed and altitude of the SR-71 simply hypnotized everyone. Every attempted intercept of a Blackbird was considered a top priority. If there was a mistake made by anyone, be it on the ground or in the air, a court-martial was sure to follow.
It's not good at all!
But it wasn't as though the spy plane crept up on the Soviets out of nowhere. Generally, information about an inbound Blackbird was received from the radio intercept stations about 3 hours prior. The intercept stations were able to hear the conversations between the Blackbird and their in-flight refueling tanker. Major Miyagi goes on. The scheme for intercepting the SR-71 called for the MiG to be prepared to launch exactly 16 minutes after the first alert of an approaching Blackbird. 2 minutes for the aircrews to don their altitude compensating flight suits, 2 minutes to run to the aircraft and get strapped in, and the next 12 minutes was used to check out the aircraft's systems, start the engines, and taxi to the end of the runway where they would await the signal to launch. The procedure for intercepting was calculated to the very second. And while the MiGs were preparing, the ground vectoring station was determining the route the Blackbird was taking. You see, it wasn't enough to know where the spy plane was. They needed to determine where it was going and when it would be there. It's similar to the way a quarterback has to lead the receiver when throwing him a pass. 5 minutes after takeoff, the MiG-31 would reach an altitude of almost 53,000 feet. The goal was to reach an altitude of 60,696 to 63,676. This provided the best missile launch trajectory. The Foxhounds used infrared to intercept the American spy plane. Because of the large IR signature produced by the SR-71's engines, the Soviets were afforded the opportunity to detect it at a range of 75 miles. Now that might seem like a long way, but when you're traveling Mach 3, that distance is covered very quickly. Once the Foxhound was in position and the target was captured by the infrared detection system, a female voice in the cockpit, known to the aircrews as Rita, would say, "Attack!" Attack! That's when the plane's R-33 missile was prepped. The R-33 is a long-range air-to-air missile and is the primary armament of the MiG-31. It was designed to attack large, high-speed targets, such as the SR-71, the B-1, and the B-52. Now, according to the Soviets, there was no way the SR-71 could escape an R-33, which had a range of 75 miles and a top speed of Mach 4.5, which was greater than the speed of the SR-71. Now, the Soviet rules of engagement only allowed for a missile launch to occur if an SR-71 or other American aircraft were to breach Soviet airspace. And that was something the United States had officially banned after the U-2 was shot down in 1960. But that didn't mean that the Soviets couldn't intercept the Blackbird for a friendly game of cat and mouse as the aircraft skirted the coast of the USSR. Major Miyagi recounts one of those intercepts in 1986. It was on his 8th intercept and was the very first time that he ever laid eyes on a Blackbird. It was 1100 hours and the alert was sounded that an SR-71 was approaching. And the alert consisted of a shrill bell and then confirmed over a loudspeaker. According to the major, an alert of an SR-71 approaching was always met with nervousness and a reaction of excessive emotion. Once airborne and at an altitude of just over 26,000 feet in his MiG-31, Major Miyagi accelerated through the sound barrier. The responsibility for vectoring the major and his weapons systems officer was now with the ground station. They now ascended to over 52,000 feet and a speed of Mach 2.3. The WSO now turned on the IR detection equipment and within 5 seconds had the incoming Blackbird captured. Once he did, Rita's voice came over the headset and announced attack. That's when they began their intercept. Major Miyagi, in his MiG, executed their aiming run. They flew to 62,000 feet and closed the distance to 37 miles. It was then that he spotted the contrail of the SR-71 they were chasing and now on course to intercept. The Major reported to his WSO that he had visual on the target. The MiG-31 passed underneath the Blackbird and at an altitude only several thousand feet below, close enough to make out the black silhouette of the spy plane. It was one of the closest intercepts of an SR-71 ever made by a MiG. The SR-71 was flying over the ocean paralleling the coast in neutral waters. Major Miyagi reported their position and that he was breaking off the intercept as it made no sense to continue to follow. They had only been airborne for 15 minutes and 40 seconds. Because the MiG was traveling at speeds in excess of Mach 2, the aircraft's skin and canopy heated to over 800 degrees Celsius. That meant that it became necessary to cool it off prior to descending to a lower altitude. If they didn't, there was a chance of cracking, which could result in a catastrophic failure. Major Miyagi slowed to Mach 1.6 and held steady at that speed. After 30 seconds, he slowed to subsonic and began to descend further. Soon, they approached the airfield where it all began 50 minutes prior. And Major Miyagi says that he flew 14 intercepts against the Blackbird and that this was the one and only time he was ever able to see it with his own eyes. He states that a combination of circumstances came together to make it possible. Good weather and visibility, an unusual occurrence in that part of the world, not the least of which. The SR-71 retired from Air Force service in 1998. And although numerous attempts to shoot it down were made, none were ever successful. However, it was almost accidentally shot down by Sweden. But that's a story for another time. The MiG-31 is still in service with Russia, and after all of these years, it is still a formidable aircraft. But it's no match for the F-22 Raptor flown by the United States Air Force. And despite never being tested in a dogfight, the Air Force claims that the Raptor is the finest fighter jet ever built, and one that no other aircraft is capable of matching. And whether that's true or not, I guess is debatable. To learn more about the F-22 Raptor and its amazing capabilities, click the screen now. And if you like this video, please smash that like button and leave us a comment. And until next time, I'm Dennis Gill for Revealing History.